pleasure to be here to talk about sustainable aviation fuel. I have noticed recently that, of course, I'm an academic, a professor at University of Sheffield. However, I now talk more to the investors about the risk associated with, and the interesting question they ask from me, which technology we should invest that has the lowest risk but biggest income. And but that's something to think about. So, however, I want to start. Okay, what I would like to start with a very positive message. And the overall aim was really Flight 100, which you may know about it, because it was in all news and everything, especially by Richard Branson being involved. It is very unlikely that you won't hear about it. So what we try to do in that flight to show that technology is there to use 100%. Where we have a problem is the availability of the fuel. Government can't make you fuel. It's the investors that has to invest, and therefore if the technology is there, and then you can have enough fuel to decarbonize aviation sector. So it's a very straightforward. So on that flight, what we did, it was a first transatlantic flight using both engines at 100% SAF. I had to sign a declaration that if anything happens, I will not, or whoever left, my family won't make a claim. So because of the first time it's happening, and it was a flight going from London Heathrow to New York on a normal 787 aircraft. So the purpose of the flight was really not only to show that 100% is possibility, but also to show what sort of challenges we end up with getting that certified, goes through one place to another, and what do we need to do that? What are the challenges? And this was very cross-disciplinary. You can see who was involved. Virgin Atlantic, Rolls-Royce, Boeing, Pratt & Whitney, both Canadian and American and UK companies, but it was initiated by UK. And really it was very much like a moonshot flight. It was a SAF flight simply to show that it can happen and you can do it. Technology is there. And in terms of what I sought to do, to show you a 1 minute speech by Prime Minister to do with this flight, and he talks about opportunities for the UK industry and investors. So if hopefully it works.
Right now, something very exciting is happening in the sky above us. It all started with a government competition to support the industry to achieve the first net zero transatlantic flight.
The irony of that is we spent a while trying to figure out the clicker doesn't work because the audio is supposed to work.
On an aircraft using 100% sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. Our government made up to £1 million of funding available to support the project, and right now it's taking off. Today's Virgin Atlantic flight to New York will be entirely fueled by SAF made primarily from waste oils and fats. Not only will SAF be key in decarbonising aviation, but it could create a UK industry with an annual turnover of almost £2.5 billion, which could support over 5,000 UK jobs. It's great that British businesses and institutions like Virgin Atlantic, Rolls-Royce, Boeing and Sheffield University continue to raise the bar in aviation. Now that is blue sky thinking.
Okay, and this is the interesting times and in order to assure investors, this opposition also has a similar view. So whatever happens in the next 2 years, we still have similar sort of attitude towards the aviation sector. So let's move on to, as investors, you say, well, what's the future for aviation? And if you look at these numbers, you will see that in terms of the air passenger forecast, right, so 2019 has become a very interesting year because of the COVID and suddenly all flights stopped. So what I've done in this slide, take that as a 100% or unit that we can compare what happens in future. And the blue indicates the domestic flights and the orange is international. So you see on 2021 is starting to grow, but not as much as to 2019. But look at 2023. We already passed the numbers that we were sort of using for 2019. And remember that everybody was saying this COVID has made a big difference. It will take another 10 years before we get to that number. And by 2025, predictions are that we will be at least 20% more than where we were in 2019. Aviation is a sector that only produces a small amount of CO2, global CO2, only 2.5%, plus non-CO2 makes it to 3.5%, but produces at high altitude, where the impact is the biggest. And therefore, no issues that you end up with a lot of legislations, mandates that coming through. And the aviation sector has to do it. And I hope marine sector gets some sort of push by legislation to get to that point. So, but you have heard a lot about hydrogen. Hydrogen will solve all the problems. Or batteries, fuel cells, they will solve the problem. This is from ATAG, coming from sector who sort of decides and takes into account the view from the stakeholders, takes the view from OEMs, and look at that number. By 2050, long-haul flight, there is no option but SAF. And even on a medium and short-haul flight, you just have starting to see hydrogen and other fuels like battery. So in terms of future investment, this is the picture. Nothing happening before 2050. And that is SAF will be with us, whether we like it or not. But and this is the question that I get a lot from investors. Which sector should I, now that I'm going to invest, where should I do it? Which technology should I use? This is a very interesting view from, or report from World Economic Forum. And they look at these numbers very carefully from different processes. Flight 100 used HEFA. We used HEFA in that flight. But if you look at the overall life cycle analysis, you see that only 78% up to 84% of fossil fuel is replaced. The rest is still CO2. However, look at the power to liquid, the next generation technology, 99%. And there is no issue because it's using CO2 and hydrogen to produce power to liquid. You have no problem with the energy security, which is very important part. Environment is one part of it, but energy security is another important issue. And if you look at beyond UK, you see that investment and this sort of production is happening all over the Europe, as well as, of course, in US. And one area that we should also talk about is that how legislations, mandates, directives will have a big influence on investors' decision. And 10% mandate that come into UK, hopefully, will require 1.5 billion liters. At this moment, we only produce 0.1. And we have to get by 2030 to 1.5 billion. So you can see the potential for investment there. And what I was mentioning before during a discussion, that what I do notice, a lot of US investors are now moving to the UK market. I can give you a few companies that have already receiving big investments from non-UK investors, and the potential for UK investors is there to look at because of the future market. Power to liquid as a jet for jet fuel, I believe is if you're looking at long term, is the best technology. It will provide you with the options that you don't have to worry about availability of the biomass or availability of waste. There are small amounts there, and with biomass you have to be very careful. The issue of food for fuel or fuel for food is essential, that we don't suddenly let all the farmers suddenly produce biomass to produce power to liquid. So that's very important. And however, the challenges and opportunities for power to liquid, I have mentioned there. If you use power to liquid, is the net zero, because over 99% fossil fuel replacement. It doesn't have any impact on the water demand, because biomass is not biomass based, and no land demand. If we try to produce 1.2 billion of fossil fuel based on SAF, the whole UK has to be covered by biomass. So we have to take that into account. And the challenges is a high cost of hydrogen. But if we believe on US strategy of $1 per 1 ton within the 10 years, by 2030, hydrogen will be even cheaper than normal hydrogen that we get at the moment. And if that's the case, then the price of the power to liquid will be very similar to fossil fuel, if we assume that fossil fuel remains same price. That's the technology. I'm not going to show you this in details. I'm running out of my time. But however, there are technologies available, but this sort of technology not only decarbonize aviation, but also supports carbon capture, direct air capture, as well as, of course, green hydrogen production at the same time. All of them, however we look at it, will depend on the policy. And I would say the main things for decarbonization and investment, to have a clear vision what the government wants to do. Because without that security for investors, that there are really legislation coming, you won't get to investors to take a high risk and invest on something that may not be the case in a few years' time. But for SAF, at least UK has a SAF challenge, and they are using RIA for that to fund it. It's the first time that US is investing and subsidizing fuel. That is very important, and usually world follows what happens in US. And European Union, they will announce major issues by directives very soon in March in Ireland, that how the SAF will become an important player in the future. And the UK, of course, has the 10% mandate. But building that regional SAF supply is also very important, and availability of feedstock. And one area that I say that investors usually worry about is that ASTM approval, because every fuel that to be used has to be certified through a very difficult sort of process to make sure that it is safe. So to conclude is that from my point of view, and I'm sure that if you look, many have the similar views, that PTL or power to liquid is a way forward at long term. And there are areas of research, but the technology at higher TRL, 3 to 6 even over 6. So is not in a fundamental research area, but is at a level that you can actually commercialize it. However, similar to many other technology, you remember that when you had a mobile phone 20 years ago, some of you young enough not to see that, it was a big box and you had to carry a big box to use the mobile. Now it's a very small. It will happen the same in the power to liquid. It will improve as more and more technology is used. But at the same time, any investors that thinking about aviation fuel should never forget about ASTM approval procedure, which will be an important part of the process. Thank you.